In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a powerful office computer for basic office applications, but also a good mid-level gaming computer on a budget using some existing parts. I will list in the description below all of the parts I used for this build and which ones I purchased and which ones I reused from existing projects. This is a case that I have, pretty inexpensive. It has lots of ventilation, as you can see from the holes in it. And the reason I bought this case was mainly because it is a full ATX case, or at least it will fit a full ATX power supply, which I'm going to reuse from another project. In order to install a full ATX size power supply, there's an adapter that comes with this case. And this is what I'm installing at this point. Later I'm going to show how you can actually hide most of these cables, which are not even actually going to be used in this project. These are the parts I'm using for this build. This is a MSI motherboard. It's a B650M with Wi-Fi. B650 is the chipset, and it supports 3 different AMD processors: the 5000 series, 7000 series, and 9000 series. I'm using the AMD Ryzen 5 processor, the 7600 model. That's the mid-level model. So this is kind of future-proofing this build. Sometime in the future, I can upgrade to the 9000 series if I desire, without having to change the motherboard. Next, we have the M.2 SSD, which will be screwed to the motherboard. This will be the main storage for the system, and it will hold 1 terabyte. Then we have 32 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. And a heatsink and fan cooler for the processor. Let's unbox everything. Here's what the motherboard looks like. Here's the RAM slots. This is where the processor goes. This is where the M.2 stick goes. This is where the video card will go eventually. This is the NVMe M.2 SSD. These are the 216 gigabit RAM sticks. And this is the cooler for the processor. It's going to go right about here. Let's begin by installing the RAM. The RAM is keyed, so it can only go in one way. And since we're using 2 sticks, they need to go in slots 2 and 4. That's considered channel A. Slots 1 and 3 would be for channel B. So if you're going to put in 4 sticks, you could populate all 4 slots. But if you're doing just 2, you usually put them in 2 and 4. Push down firmly and they will click in to the holders. Next, we're going to install the processor. Before installing the processor and the processor cooler on the motherboard, it's a good idea to make sure the motherboard is going to fit into the case. The cases come, at least this one comes with these standoffs already installed, and I want to make sure there's a standoff for every one of the mounting holes on the motherboard. So that's what I'm test fitting here. It looks like the standoffs are all in the correct place, so we're ready to go. Now we can install the processor. First, we open the socket with this lever, and there's a lid that you can lift up and see all the pins inside. It's a good idea to maybe take a magnifying glass and examine these pins and make sure that none of them are deformed or bent. These look good. The processor is keyed just like the RAM is keyed, so it can only go in one way into the socket. Here's what the bottom looks like. It has these pads that go onto the pins. And this is the key here. It's a little arrow. And there's also one on the socket. These have to line up. So you can just place the processor in there. Be careful, make sure you get this lined up correctly. I jiggle it around a little bit just to make sure it's fully seated. Then you close the lid, and when you put this lever down, it locks it in firmly and it pops off this plastic cover. Now you're done. Here we're going to install the cooler on the processor. Depending on the brand of the processor, Intel or AMD, determines which hardware to use for this particular cooler. For this one, these two middle brackets are going to work. This is an AMD motherboard and AMD processor. We have to remove these plastic brackets from the top of the motherboard first. Then we can install these metal brackets that go with this cooler for AMD processors. Next, we need to install some thermal paste on the processor to help with the heat conductivity between the processor and the cooler that's going to be mounted on top of it. There are lots of different ways to do this, but what I'm going to do is put about a pea-sized dab in the middle and then wrap some plastic wrap around my finger and smear it out across the processor to be evenly distributed across the top of the processor. Now we're going to mount the cooler on top of the processor and screw it down to the brackets that we installed earlier. You're going to see that we go back and forth and we tighten these screws a little bit at a time so you're evenly distributing the weight or the force across these brackets on top of the processor. Next, we're installing two fans on the cooler, and we're using some metal clips to do this. And we want the fans to blow the heat in the direction of the back of the PC. Now I'm going to wire these two fans together for power, and they're going to plug into a header on the motherboard for CPU fan power. I'm going to test the system out on the bench before I install the motherboard in the case. That way, if there's anything that might go wrong and need some troubleshooting, it's a lot easier to do on the bench than it would be inside the case. So I move the case next to the bench and I'm pulling the cables over for the power supply, and I'm going to install those now. The SSD drive has already been installed. I don't think I showed that. So it's basically a complete system. The other thing is the power button and LED light from the top of the case. I'm going to hook that up into the motherboard at this point too. I'm also going to hook up a keyboard, mouse, monitor, everything else that's needed to complete the system. I typically use a wired keyboard and mouse just to make it simpler for the first boot. Just doing some final checks before the first boot. I also added a small speaker or buzzer to the header on the motherboard. This will give you the quick little beep to let you know that boot up is in progress and everything's okay. A long beep would indicate a problem. This motherboard also has some LEDs on it that will indicate any problems related to boot up. Going with the first boot. Fans are on. I'm going to check the LEDs in the back, and I'd have to consult the manual to know what these LEDs mean, but it does appear it's going through some kind of a process. One of the things I'll mention is on the first boot, you can just boot up into the BIOS and see what that looks like and play with the settings. What I'm going to do is I have Linux Mint loaded on a USB drive, and I'm going to plug that in here and boot up. And the BIOS will detect that, and so I'm going to tell the BIOS that I want the USB drive to be the first thing for it to boot up in after this first test here. So it looks like something is happening. I'm starting to see something on the monitor. And here we go. It's booting up. And we're in the BIOS. So it looks like the system is working. So you should take some time and take a look at your BIOS here and see what you see. For example, the CPU speed should be what you were expecting. You should see the RAM listed here. I have 32 gig of RAM, I see that. Other information, so for example, there's the boot up order, and I am moving, it looks like what I'm doing is moving the USB drive to be the first thing for it to boot up on. And then what you do is you hit usually F10 to save, and then it'll boot up and you'll get your first boot into your operating system so you can install it. I have now booted up into the operating system, which is Linux, from this USB drive. And in the upper left hand corner you can see it says install Linux Mint. And so I'm going to click on that and start getting my operating system installed onto the M.2 drive. Now that the system is running and we already have the operating system installed, let's disconnect everything and install the motherboard into the case. Install the I/O shield. Some motherboards come with these installed right on the back of the motherboard. Most of them you have to install it into the case yourself. Carefully place the motherboard inside the case on top of all of the standoffs and start to screw them down. Now you can start to hook up all the cables to the motherboard again. This case and most modern cases have cable management, and what that means is there's a panel in there where you can hide most of the cables behind the motherboard so that you won't see them from the clear glass on the front of the case. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm hooking up the power and the connection to the front of the case, you know, where the power button is and the LED and all of that. Now that we have everything hooked up inside the case, let's make sure everything works again. So we'll hook up the monitor, mouse, keyboard, network, all of that stuff, and turn it back on and make sure everything is working. Here's a pro tip for you. Turn on the power supply. It helps. The system is booting up properly, so let's continue with the build. I have an SSD drive from my old computer, 500 gigabyte drive. I'm going to install that in this one for file backup. And this case comes with some rubber grommets that you can mount to the SSD drive. Then you just hook up the signal and the power cables, and the drive can just be slid in place. Here's what this case offers in the way of cable management. This section is where you can push all of your unused cables so you don't see them from the glass side of the case. It dresses it up very nicely. And most of these cables you see here are extra cables from the power supply that are not needed for this build. Here's what the completed case looks like. I have it mounted under my desk right now, so it's out of the way. There's no GPU, graphics processing unit, in it right now. I'm still shopping for that. The market for those is very volatile right now, so I'm hoping to see either a more powerful card come out or something with a better price point in the near future. I used this computer to create this video. Thanks for watching.